In part 2 of this food molecules lecture, we'll look at lipids. Lipids is a broad category of molecules. We'll talk about which specific things are under the category of lipids, but here are the roles of lipids. Energy storage. Here you can actually see a coconut. And a coconut is actually a giant seed. It has a lot of fat stored inside it, and that fat's going to be energy for this sprouting embryo to grow into a new tree. Lipids also serve as protection. Here you can see some waxes on a leaf that prevent it from getting soaked with water too much, or fat surrounding our vital organs that provides cushioning. Right? It's protective padding that prevents those organs from bouncing around or getting damaged. Buoyancy, the ability to float, and also insulation, trapping heat, keeping animals and other things warm. We have lipids that play roles as a structural material. We'll talk down here in part B about cholesterol. Cholesterol plays an important role in our cell membrane as animals. Or these things up here called phospholipids that make up our cell membranes and the cell membranes of all living things. And lastly, there are some hormones that are based on lipids. Estradiol is the precursor for estrogen. And then down here we have testosterone. Those are based on lipids, these two hormones. So, three general categories of lipids: sterols, fats, and phospholipids. Sterols play a role in regulating our growth and development, as those two hormones examples I talked about, but also in helping to stabilize our cell membranes with cholesterol. Fats, mainly energy storage, insulation, buoyancy, cushioning, and phospholipids make up the main component of cell membranes. So let's talk first about cholesterol, a type of sterol. You can see that ending there, cholesterol. So cholesterol helps animal cell membranes to maintain the right degree of fluidity. What that means is it prevents the membranes from getting too liquidy, where they just fall apart, but also prevents them from getting too thick, because then things couldn't pass through. It keeps the right degree of that, or the right amount of that. Additionally, cholesterol is used as a precursor or a building block upon which to make other important hormones. Cholesterol can be made in our body or taken in from our food. We'll talk about how the main source of cholesterol is actually not directly eating cholesterol, it comes from something else. So if you go to the doctor and they say you've got high cholesterol, what does that mean? Well, there's these two different types of cholesterol, LDL and HDL. You do not need to know what exactly it stands for, this low density lipoprotein and high, but you do need to know which is the bad one and which is the good one. One way to remember that is I take the L here for LDL and I write out lethal, meaning that's bad, right? And H for healthy. That's one way to remember. H is good, healthy, L is bad, is lethal. So the bad cholesterol here, the LDL, if you eat poorly, that can increase those levels, and it can cause an increased risk of heart attacks and other aspects of cardiovascular disease. Whereas the good cholesterol can be increased through good diet and also exercise, and it helps to reduce the risk of heart disease. So you'll find cholesterol in animal-derived foods as a direct source, but also cholesterol is made by the body. And actually, the vast majority of cholesterol in our body, almost 90% of the bad cholesterol, is not coming from the direct consumption of cholesterol. Instead, this is very important, is coming from eating saturated fats. These could be saturated fats from animal products or saturated fats from plant products, either one. When it's taken in, our liver processes it, and that bad cholesterol, that LDL, is produced. So you want to limit your intake of saturated fats if your LDL is too high. And so most younger individuals don't really have to worry too much about cholesterol unless you're really unhealthy. But as you age, it becomes a large problem. You can see down here that almost 60% of Americans in their 50s have high cholesterol. So it's a big problem, leading to a greatly increased chance of heart disease. And so why is LDL bad? Well, LDL tends to stick inside the walls of our arteries, leading to these blockages or partial blockages called plaque, which we'll talk more about in the next unit. HDL, the healthy, the good cholesterol, has the opposite effect. It helps to remove that LDL and helps to get it out of there, help to reduce the size of that plaque. So HDL is actually good. You want to have enough of that, whereas you want LDL to be as low as possible. So let's talk now about some of those hormones that are based on cholesterol. These are called steroid hormones, or they're also called sex hormones. And that's because these two hormones, estrogen and testosterone, help to regulate sexual development and sexual functioning. The production of our sex cells, ova or eggs, and sperm. Additionally, they have other effects called effects on secondary sexual characteristics, like the deepening of your voice, growth of body hair, breast development, etc. And there are other functions. So can anybody think of a tissue that grows in response to testosterone? Some athletes, more in the past, would try to take synthetic testosterone to grow this tissue. Any thoughts? If you thought muscle growth, you'd be exactly right. This is me before I got into teaching, had a different career path, but equally successful. And how about estrogen? What effects does estrogen have on the brain? Well, think about some of those movies or TV shows when they portray a woman before or during her period, right? What is estrogen doing? Well, estrogen has an effect on mood and also on memory. So it's not just this made up thing, there's some real science behind it. So a couple questions here about sterols. Who has estrogen? And who has testosterone? Both males and females have estrogen, and males and females also have testosterone. However, in females, estrogen is usually higher and testosterone is usually lower. While in males, it's the opposite. In males, estrogen is lower, but testosterone is higher. But they're present in both males and females. As I mentioned before, some athletes have actually used artificial or synthetic versions of testosterone to build muscle mass. So they call these anabolic. Remember anabolism we talked about before? Building up of stuff is used to build more muscle mass. Anabolic steroids. They'll trigger increased muscle mass, but also can have dangerous side effects on your health, like increased chance of stroke, for example. Now let's talk about fat. So our main fat in our diet consists of what's called a triglyceride. Each triglyceride has one glycerol molecule, you can see that down here, and three, hence tri, are called fatty acids or fatty acid tails, the long parts of that molecule. If we take in more calories than we need, and our body's already filled up all of our glycogen stores in our liver and our muscle, now the body's going to store those extra calories by putting more of these triglycerides or making more of them within our adipose tissue, our fat tissue. Right? Adipose tissue is fat tissue. Sorry, it's a little faster than I expected to move along there. So there's some important properties here about these fatty acid tails. That's going to determine the type of fat and also make it easy to determine which fat is related to healthy fats versus bad fats. So these fatty acid tails can be straight. Let's see over here in this picture on the left, these straight tails. Or they can be kinked or crooked. And so fatty acids that have these straight tails are referred to as saturated fatty acids. So S for straight. If they are these kinked tails, they are unsaturated. We won't get into the chemistry details as to why, but these are important to know that saturated are straight and unsaturated are kinked. And the relevance of this is if they're straight, they can pack very closely together, like stacking flat sheets of paper, one on top of another. Versus if you crumple that paper up and try to stack it on top of itself, with all those kinks and bends in it, it can't pack as tightly together. And that's going to relate then to properties at like a higher level. And some fatty acids are what we call essential fatty acids, meaning your body can't make them. You must get these from your diet for proper health and development. So not all fats are bad. We need fat actually to have proper brain development, for example. And so we can take fats and group them into one of two main categories: saturated fats and unsaturated. The same terms we use for those fatty acid tails, which we'll talk about. Under unsaturated, you can further look and break that down into what's called healthy unsaturated fats. Like you may have heard of omega-3 fatty acids. Those are good fats. They're under the healthy category. Or trans fats. Trans fats are very bad fats that luckily we've banned here in the United States in terms of adding that to food, but for a while they were a big problem. So first of all, oil is fat. It's just liquid at room temperature. And so all fats are a mixture of triglycerides that have some saturated or straight fatty acid tails and some unsaturated. Oils, like I said, are fats that are liquid at room temperature, like the vegetable oils that many people use in cooking: olive oil, canola oil, peanut oil, corn oil, safflower oil, avocado oil, etc. But also you'll find some unsaturated fats in fish. So fats that are liquid at room temperature are called unsaturated fats because they have more of these unsaturated fatty acids. And if you remember, the unsaturated ones had those kinked tails, so they can't pack tightly together. And because they can't pack tightly together, they can't turn into a solid easily. They stay liquid at room temperature. Solid fats, on the other hand, are solid at room temperature, obviously. This would be fats from animals, so beef fat, fat from chicken, from pork, etc., butter, shortening. Shortening is actually where they've taken a vegetable fat and they've converted it into a saturated fat. So it mainly comes from animal products, but it can also be made from vegetable oils, hence the shortening through a process called hydrogenation. We won't need to know that process, but that converts these unsaturated ones into saturated. And so they're called saturated because they have more of these saturated fatty acids, these straight tails. Other solid ones are called trans fats. These are actually not saturated fats. If you remember on the previous chart, they were under the unsaturated category, but they're actually solid at room temperature. They have a very unique structure that is hard for our body to process and has very bad effects for our health. So the saturated are solid at room temperature because the molecules can pack tightly together and turn into a solid. Here's a quick review here. So you got a brownie recipe, and pretty much all brownie recipes call for some sort of lipid to be added, unless you're substituting, say, applesauce. But most would call for either butter or oil of some type, usually vegetable oil. So here, if you want brownies that stay chewy after they cool, which should you use, butter or vegetable oil? And the second question is, which of these brownies would be healthier? Well, neither's going to be healthy, but which is going to be less unhealthy? Those with butter or those with vegetable oil? Pause, take a minute to think about it, decide your answer, and then resume the video. So for the first question, let's think about this. If brownies cool back down and they're made of butter, what's going to happen to that butter when it cools down? It's going to re-solidify, making those brownies very dense. Vegetable oil, on the other hand, will still stay liquid when it cools down, which makes those brownies very chewy. So the vegetable oil is the one that's going to keep the brownies chewy. If you want a more dense brownie, have butter, which would be healthier. Again, neither one's healthy, but because the vegetable oil contains more of those unsaturated fats, those are going to be better for your health. We'll talk about those health effects now and why unsaturated is better on these upcoming slides. Before we get to that, let's talk about one specific type here of unsaturated fat. So omega-3 fatty acids, these were part of the unsaturated. These reduce the chance of heart disease. You'll find these here, you can see in chicken, eggs, peanuts, beans, and fish. Good for proper brain development and proper functioning. So you want to get some of these in your diet. They're good for you. We can't make them without eating them. We have to get them in our diet. So why are saturated fats the bad fats and unsaturated generally are the good? Well, saturated fats increase the bad cholesterol, L for lethal. That increases your chance then of heart disease because that builds up on the walls of your arteries and forms plaques. Unsaturated has the opposite effect. It reduces the bad cholesterol and can also, in some cases, increase the good cholesterol. The exception to this is with trans fats. Trans fats are very, very, very bad for your health. Even though they're unsaturated, they are not good. If you're interested, here's a quick link to a little calorie quiz asking you to compare two different things like a cup of grape tomatoes and 20 M&Ms and decide which has more calories. It's kind of interesting. You can just use your cell phone, put it on the camera function, scan this, and it should then be able to open up a link to take the quiz, just for fun. So one thing to consider is that even though saturated fats are bad for you and unsaturated are good for you, there actually is a little more detail to it than that. When we're saying that the unsaturated are good for you, they're good in moderation. If you eat too much, you get too many calories, that's still going to be bad for your health. So all fat molecules, no matter what type, have 9 calories per gram, way more calories than proteins or carbs do. So even eating too much of an unsaturated fat could have some adverse health effects. We said before, if you take in too many calories, that first your body makes glycogen, but you actually can't store a lot of calories in glycogen. It takes up a lot of space. It's not very efficient in terms of storage. And so the vast majority of calories in our body are stored as fat. Typically about 100,000 calories in an average healthy 150-pound person. If you think about that, if you ate 2,000 calories a day, right, we'll say that's your diet, 2,000 calories per day, and you've got 10,000 calories stored in your body, that means you could live for 50 days on average off your fat. Pretty amazing. The last category of lipids we'll talk about today to finish up are the phospholipids. Phospholipids make up, as you can see here, our cell membranes. These are the main components of the cell membrane. And phospholipids have these two different regions here. Up here, this is the phosphate head. And down here, these are the fatty acid or lipid tails. Hence the name phospholipid. The phosphate head is hydrophilic. What do you think that means? Well, it says right here. Attracted to water. Philic or phile means lover of. Hydrophilic, lover of water. Hydrophobic, these are the tails, they don't like water. They have a fear of water. They're repelled by water. So what happens is if you put these phospholipids into water, they're going to orient themselves. So the parts that like water, the heads, are facing watery areas, like outside your cells, or the cytoplasm, inside your cells. And then sandwiched in the middle, that's where you have the hydrophobic tails facing each other. That makes up the cell membrane. So plasma membrane is another name for animal cell membrane. And remember that cell membranes are present in all cells, no matter what the type. And phospholipids are the main component for all types of cell membranes. A few questions here to finish up. Take a minute to read through this, choose your answer, pause the video, and then we'll discuss. Okay, so for this question, we're looking at how milk from animals also contains some hormones in it in relatively small amounts. Estrogen is the one we're focusing on here. Estrogen is fat soluble. What does that mean? We talked before about fat soluble toxins with biomagnification or bioaccumulation. Fat soluble, if you've forgotten, means it dissolves in fat. And so you'd expect the highest levels of estrogen in what? Well, the first thing you want to know is what do these percentages mean? If you don't know this, if you're not a milk drinker, 4% means that that's the percent that is actually fat. So 4% of whole milk is fat. 2% of 2% milk is fat. 98% is something else. And so in this case, the highest level of estrogen was going to be in the milk that has the most fat, because estrogen dissolves in fat. The more fat there is, the more estrogen that's going to be dissolved in there and retained in that milk. And that's it for this topic. We'll do some more practice questions and other stuff with this in class.